August 9th, 1945. Dawn broke over the Manchurian forests with an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the earth itself. The dense canopy of birch and pine filtered the early light into pale shafts that barely penetrated the undergrowth. Somewhere in the depths of these endless woodlands, the metallic clank of tracked vehicles echoed like distant thunder. If you're interested in untold stories from the Eastern Front, consider subscribing for more historical accounts that shaped our world. Major Takeshi Yamamoto adjusted his field glasses with trembling fingers, not from cold, but from something far more unsettling. 3 days had passed since Soviet forces had crossed into Manchuria, and already the carefully planned Japanese defensive positions were crumbling. The sound that haunted him most wasn't the roar of enemy tanks or the whistle of artillery. It was the absence of his own men's voices on the radio frequencies. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions from his observation post, a living maze that had become their prison. Yamamoto's 23rd Infantry Regiment had been tasked with holding the approaches to Mudanjiang, but the enemy had materialized from the trees themselves like phantoms. No massive frontal assaults. No predictable tank columns charging across open ground. Instead, Soviet forces seemed to melt through the woodland, striking supply lines, communication posts, and isolated units with surgical precision. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Yamamoto froze, straining to identify the source. The forest had taught him that every sound carried meaning, every shadow might conceal death. His Batman, Corporal Sato, crouched beside him with wide eyes that had lost their naive confidence. The young soldier clutched his Arisaka rifle with white knuckles, the metal warm from constant handling. Through the trees, Yamamoto caught glimpses of abandoned Japanese equipment. An overturned supply truck here, a discarded machine gun nest there. The detritus of retreat painted a clear picture of how quickly their positions had collapsed. What troubled him most was the methodical nature of the destruction. Soviet forces hadn't simply overrun their lines, they had dissected them with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The radio crackled with fragmented reports from surviving units. Lieutenant Ogawa's company had lost contact with battalion headquarters 12 hours ago. Captain Mori's defensive position near the river crossing had gone silent at midnight. Each missing voice represented dozens of men who had simply vanished into the green depths of Manchuria's wilderness. Yamamoto remembered his training at the Imperial War College, where instructors had emphasized the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over mere tactical innovation. The forests of Manchuria were teaching him a different lesson entirely. Here, spirit meant little when the enemy refused to reveal themselves for honorable combat. Soviet tactics felt alien, almost supernatural in their effectiveness. A distant rumble grew steadily louder, the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery moving through dense vegetation. Yamamoto pressed himself deeper into his concealed position, recognizing the rhythmic grinding of tank treads against forest floor. But these weren't the massive steel behemoths he had expected. The Soviet armor moved with surprising stealth through terrain that should have been impassable for mechanized forces. The first T-34 emerged from behind a thick stand of birch trees like a green-painted ghost. Its turret swiveled methodically, scanning for targets with mechanical patience. Yamamoto had studied Soviet tank specifications extensively, but seeing one navigate the forest with such fluid grace challenged everything he thought he understood about armored warfare. More tanks followed, their crews clearly trained in woodland combat techniques that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. They advanced using natural cover with the skill of infantry, pausing at irregular intervals to listen for defensive positions. Each vehicle was camouflaged with fresh-cut branches that made them nearly invisible until they moved. Sato's breathing became shallow and rapid beside him. The corporal had witnessed the destruction of 3 different company positions over the past 48 hours, each time barely escaping through sheer luck. His faith in Japanese military superiority had been systematically dismantled by an enemy that seemed to understand the forest better than they understood themselves. A new sound emerged from deeper in the woods, the methodical crack of small arms fire, followed by silence. Another Japanese position had been located and eliminated. Yamamoto tried to calculate how many men his regiment had lost, but the numbers became meaningless when entire companies simply disappeared without sending distress signals. The Soviet advance represented something fundamentally different from the warfare he had studied and prepared for. These weren't the desperate human wave attacks that propaganda had promised. Instead, enemy forces moved through the forest like a living organism, flowing around strong points and striking at vulnerable connections between units. Yamamoto closed his eyes and listened to the forest's voice. Somewhere in that natural symphony of wind through leaves and settling wood, death moved with patient efficiency. His men were being hunted by an enemy that had transformed the wilderness itself into a weapon. When he opened his eyes, 3 more T-34s had materialized from the green shadows, their commanders scanning the terrain with professional competence. One tank paused directly below his hiding place, its engine idling with mechanical confidence. The turret traversed slowly, methodically examining every tree, every shadow that might conceal Japanese defenders. The forest had become an arena where all his training meant nothing. Here, in the depths of Manchuria's endless woodlands, the Imperial Japanese Army was learning what it meant to be prey. The metallic scrape of tank treads against frozen earth echoed through the valley as dawn broke over the Manchurian steppes on August 10, 1945. Colonel Tanaka pressed his palm against the cold steel of his Type 97 Chiha, watching Soviet armor formations emerge from the morning mist like iron ghosts. The bitter wind carried the distant rumble of Katyusha rockets, a sound that would haunt Japanese positions for days to come. Major Ishikawa adjusted his field glasses, studying the enemy advance through the sparse birch groves that dotted the landscape. The Soviets moved with mechanical precision, their T-34s cutting through defensive positions that had taken months to fortify. Behind the armor, endless columns of infantry advanced through the forest corridors, their white camouflage making them nearly invisible against the late summer snow that clung to the shadows. The 23rd Infantry Regiment had prepared for conventional assault across open ground, not this systematic penetration through woodland terrain that the Red Army executed with surgical efficiency. Sergeant Yamamoto crouched behind his machine gun emplacement, watching Soviet scouts materialize from between the trees like specters. They moved without sound, communicating through hand signals that spoke of training beyond anything the Japanese forces had encountered in their Pacific campaigns. Ishikawa's radio crackled with reports from scattered outposts. Unit after unit reported the same phenomenon: Soviet forces appearing from dense forest cover where maps showed only impassable woodland. The enemy had turned the very landscape into a weapon, using natural concealment to bypass prepared positions and strike at supply lines with devastating accuracy. Each transmission grew fainter as communication posts fell silent one by one. The colonel studied the tactical map spread across his command table, red pins marking confirmed enemy positions forming an impossible pattern. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed attackers would follow roads and clearings, but the Soviets ignored such conventions entirely. They flowed through the forest canopy like water finding cracks in stone, appearing wherever Japanese forces felt most secure. Tanaka remembered the intelligence briefings from Kwantung Army headquarters, reports that dismissed Soviet forest combat capabilities as primitive guerrilla tactics unsuited for modern warfare. Those assessments lay scattered now like autumn leaves, worthless against the reality of an enemy that had transformed wilderness into military advantage. The sound of splintering wood announced another breakthrough as Soviet combat engineers cleared obstacles with explosive efficiency. Yamamoto wiped condensation from his rifle scope, trying to track movement through the tree line. Individual soldiers appeared for moments before vanishing into shadows that seemed to swallow them whole. The forest itself had become hostile territory, every rustling branch potentially concealing an enemy position. His hands trembled, not from cold but from the growing realization that familiar rules of engagement no longer applied. Radio intercepts revealed the scope of Soviet preparation. Specialized forest warfare units had spent years training in Siberian conditions, learning to navigate dense woodland with equipment specifically designed for such terrain. Their white-painted vehicles blended seamlessly with snow patches, while camouflaged artillery positions remained invisible until muzzle flashes revealed their locations. The Japanese had prepared to fight an army, but faced an environment that fought alongside their enemies. Ishikawa watched through his periscope as another defensive position succumbed to coordinated assault. Soviet tactics combined speed with stealth, using forest cover to approach within meters of Japanese emplacements before revealing their presence. The attackers seemed to emerge from the earth itself, rising from hidden positions that intelligence had never detected. Traditional counter-battery fire proved ineffective against artillery that moved continuously through woodland corridors. The metallic scraping sound returned, closer now, as Soviet armor navigated between closely spaced trees with practiced skill. Modified T-34s equipped with log armor pushed through undergrowth that would have stopped conventional vehicles, their wide tracks distributing weight across soft forest floor. Behind them, infantry advanced through pre-scouted routes marked only by subtle blazes invisible to defending forces. Tanaka issued orders for strategic withdrawal, recognizing that static defense against an enemy that controlled the terrain invited only destruction. His units would need to adapt quickly or face annihilation by forces that had turned the Manchurian wilderness into an extension of their military capability. The Forest War had begun, and the Japanese found themselves fighting not just an army, but an entire ecosystem trained to kill. August 15, 1945. The pine needles crackled underfoot as Lieutenant Yamamoto pressed deeper into the Manchurian forest. Around him, the remnants of his infantry platoon moved like ghosts between the towering trees, their khaki uniforms dark with sweat despite the cool morning air. The acrid smell of burning diesel from abandoned vehicles still lingered in his nostrils, a reminder of their hasty retreat from the main road. The forest had become their prison. For 3 days now, they had wandered through this green labyrinth, following deer paths that led nowhere, drinking from streams that tasted of iron and decay. Yamamoto clutched the brass compass his father had given him, its needle spinning uselessly in the magnetic chaos of these northern woods. Behind a massive birch trunk, Private Sato knelt beside Corporal Tanaka, whose left leg was wrapped in bloodied field dressings. The shrapnel wound from the Soviet artillery barrage had turned septic, and Tanaka's breathing came in short, labored gasps. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that Yamamoto recognized from too many battlefields. The sound reached them first, a low, mechanical hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Yamamoto raised his fist and his men froze like deer sensing wolves. The hum grew louder, resolving into the distinct rumble of T-34 tanks, but muffled, distant. The Soviets were moving through the forest roads they had carved with explosive charges, roads the Japanese had never known existed. Sato's eyes met Yamamoto's across the clearing. The young private had aged a decade in these 3 days. His hands shook as he adjusted his rifle sling, and Yamamoto noticed how the boy's fingers had gone white around the weapon's stock. Fear had a particular texture here in the woods, thick as sap, coating everything it touched. Through the canopy above, scattered sunlight painted shifting patterns on the forest floor. But these patterns held no comfort. Every shadow could conceal a Soviet sniper. Every rustle of leaves might herald an attack. The forest itself had become their enemy, turning familiar tactics into liabilities, exposing their rigid training as inadequate against this fluid, organic warfare. Yamamoto pulled out his field map, though he knew it was useless. The cartographers in Tokyo had drawn neat lines and grid squares, marking roads and rivers with confident precision. They had never walked these paths, never felt how the forest seemed to bend space, making kilometers stretch into infinities. The map showed clearings that didn't exist and rivers that had changed course decades ago. A twig snapped 30 meters to their left, then another. Not the random sounds of wildlife, but the deliberate rhythm of boots on soft earth. Yamamoto gestured sharply, and his men melted into the undergrowth. He pressed himself against the rough bark of a massive pine, feeling its resin stick to his uniform jacket. The Soviet patrol appeared like specters materializing from the forest itself. 6 men in earth-brown uniforms, moving with the fluid confidence of wolves in their territory. Their leader carried a PPSH submachine gun, its distinctive drum magazine catching brief flashes of filtered sunlight. They moved without speaking, communicating through subtle hand signals that spoke of months spent in these woods. Yamamoto watched them pass, noting how they avoided certain areas instinctively, how they tested the ground before placing their full weight on each step. These men knew secrets his training had never taught him. Which roots would hold, which branches would bend silently, which paths led to kill zones prepared weeks in advance. When the patrol had vanished back into the green maze, Yamamoto allowed himself to breathe again. But the brass compass in his palm felt heavier now, its polished surface reflecting his own wide eyes. The forest had taught him something fundamental in that moment of watching. They were not the hunters here. They had never been the hunters. Tanaka's condition worsened as they resumed their aimless march. The corporal's fever spiked, and he began muttering about cherry blossoms and his mother's cooking, his mind retreating to safer territories. Sato supported him on one side while another soldier took the other, but their pace slowed to a crawl. In the traditional warfare they had trained for, wounded comrades were evacuated by truck or stretcher bearers. Here, they simply became anchors, dragging the living down with the dying. The forest floor changed texture beneath their boots, softer now, more yielding. Yamamoto knelt and examined the earth. Recent tire tracks, partially obscured by fallen leaves but still visible to a trained eye. The Soviets had moved heavy equipment through here, probably during the night. But the tracks led deeper into the woods, following routes that existed nowhere on his maps. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they discovered the first cache. Hidden beneath a camouflaged tarp and scattered branches lay wooden crates marked with Cyrillic script. Ammunition, medical supplies, even tins of food, enough to sustain a small unit for weeks. The caches were positioned with military precision, part of a supply network that turned the entire forest into a Soviet stronghold. Yamamoto's hands trembled as he opened one of the ammunition boxes. The brass cartridges gleamed like golden teeth, factory fresh and abundant. Meanwhile, his own men had been rationing bullets since the second day, counting each round like precious coins. The disparity struck him like a physical blow. They were fighting an enemy that had transformed scarcity into abundance, disadvantage into overwhelming advantage. The brass compass caught on his sleeve as he stood, and for a moment its surface reflected not his face, but the canopy above, an endless maze of branches and leaves that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that reflection, Yamamoto finally understood what terrified him most. Not the Soviet soldiers, not their tanks or artillery, but the way this forest had exposed every assumption his military education had built. Here, maps were lies, training was inadequate, and survival depended on lessons no academy had ever taught. The metallic screech of tank tracks grinding against frozen earth pierced the dawn silence of August 12, 1945. Soviet T-34s emerged from the dense birch forests like steel phantoms, their dark hulls camouflaged with branches and mud. The morning mist clung to the Manchurian valleys, concealing the true scale of what was about to unfold. Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto pressed his binoculars against his eyes, scanning the tree line from his observation post. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now harbored an invisible menace. His 23rd Infantry Regiment had expected conventional warfare, open fields, predictable advances, familiar tactics. What they encountered instead defied every manual they had studied. The first indication came not through sight, but through sound. A low rumbling emanated from deep within the woods, too rhythmic for thunder, too sustained for artillery. Yamamoto's radio operator, Private Tanaka, received fragmented reports from forward positions. Units were vanishing without explanation. Entire companies simply stopped responding to communication. Soviet forest warfare had evolved into something the Japanese Imperial Army had never anticipated. Instead of massed frontal assaults, the Red Army moved through the woods like water finding cracks in stone. Small units materialized from seemingly impenetrable thickets, struck with devastating precision, then melted back into the green darkness. The dense Manchurian forests became their ally, transforming every tree into potential cover, every clearing into a killing field. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov guided his reconnaissance unit through a maze of fallen logs and underbrush. His men moved with practiced silence, their boots finding purchase on moss-covered ground that muffled their approach. Each soldier carried specialized equipment for forest combat: compact submachine guns, grenades designed for close quarters, and most importantly, intimate knowledge of woodland tactics developed through years of fighting in similar terrain. The psychological impact on Japanese forces proved as devastating as the physical attacks. Soldiers trained for honor-bound, face-to-face combat found themselves fighting ghosts. The enemy appeared from behind, above, and below, emerging from dugouts concealed beneath root systems, dropping from tree platforms, rising from stream beds. Traditional military formations became liabilities in the dense woodland, where visibility rarely extended beyond 50 meters. Sergeant Mikhail Volkov positioned his squad along a game trail that intelligence suggested the Japanese would use for their retreat. The forest floor around them bore evidence of recent passage: broken twigs, displaced leaves, the faint petroleum scent that clung to military equipment. His men had transformed themselves into extensions of the woodland itself, their uniforms adorned with local vegetation, faces streaked with mud and bark fragments. Yamamoto received orders to advance despite mounting casualties among his reconnaissance patrols. Each unit sent into the forest returned diminished, if at all. Those who survived spoke of an enemy that seemed to know the terrain with supernatural intimacy. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to fighting in familiar environments, found themselves disoriented by the endless repetition of trees, the way sounds echoed strangely through the canopy, the manner in which the forest seemed to shift and change when approached from different directions. The petroleum scent of engine oil mixed with pine resin and damp earth created an olfactory signature that would haunt survivors for decades. Soviet armored units had modified their tactics for forest warfare, using smaller, more maneuverable vehicles that could navigate between trees. These mechanical predators struck supply convoys along narrow forest roads, then disappeared into the green maze before reinforcements could arrive. Intelligence reports filtered back to Japanese command centers painted an increasingly desperate picture. The Soviets had not simply entered the forest, they had become part of it. Their supply lines ran along hidden paths that had been prepared months in advance. Ammunition dumps lay concealed beneath seemingly natural forest debris. Communication networks operated through buried cables that followed root systems and stream beds. Private Kenji Sato crouched behind a massive pine trunk, his rifle trained on shadows that might or might not contain enemies. The forest played tricks on perception. A branch swaying in the breeze could be a sniper taking aim. The rustle of small animals through undergrowth might mask approaching infantry. Every natural sound became suspect, every moment of silence potentially deadly. The tactical brilliance of Soviet forest warfare lay not in individual engagements, but in systematic psychological erosion. Japanese units found themselves unable to establish secure positions. Every clearing might contain hidden observers. Every path could lead to an ambush. The forest itself became weaponized, transformed from neutral terrain into an active participant in the conflict. By evening, Yamamoto's regiment had sustained 40% casualties without achieving a single tactical objective. Radio communications revealed similar stories across the entire front. The Manchurian forests were devouring Japanese forces with methodical efficiency, turning the invasion into a nightmare of invisible enemies and impossible terrain. The petroleum scent that marked Soviet positions seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, as if the forest had developed a mechanical heartbeat. The Soviet tanks rolled through clearings like metallic predators, their engines growling through the morning mist of August 12, 1945. Colonel Yamamoto pressed his binoculars against his eyes, watching the T-34s navigate between birch groves with unsettling precision. The Kwantung Army's defensive positions along the Khingan Mountains had been designed to repel frontal assaults, not this fluid infiltration through dense forest corridors. Subscribe to witness how military doctrine crumbled in Manchurian wilderness. Major Tanaka crouched beside a fallen pine trunk, his rifle scope tracking Soviet infantry moving between shadows. These weren't the massed formations his training manuals described. Small groups emerged from undergrowth, disappeared behind rock formations, reappeared 50 meters away. The sound of snapping branches had become their signature, the same brittle crack that haunted his nightmares from the previous night's ambush. The radio crackled with fragmented reports from scattered units. 3rd Battalion reported enemy contact from 3 directions simultaneously. 5th Company had lost communication entirely after reporting tank tracks in supposedly impassable terrain. The forest itself seemed to conspire with the advancing Soviets, providing concealment where Japanese planners had expected open fields of fire. Sergeant Ishida's hands trembled as he adjusted his machine gun's bipod. The morning light filtered through dense canopy, creating a patchwork of bright spots and impenetrable shadows. Every shadow could hide a Soviet scout. Every fallen log might conceal an anti-tank team. The certainty of fixed defensive lines had dissolved into a nightmare of uncertainty. Colonel Yamamoto studied his maps with growing frustration. The defensive positions marked in blue ink assumed clear sight lines and predictable approach routes. Reality offered neither. Soviet forces moved through gaps that shouldn't exist, using natural corridors that military cartographers had overlooked. The forest had become their ally, transforming familiar terrain into an alien landscape. A series of explosions echoed from the eastern ridge. The sound bounced off mountain slopes, creating multiple reverberations that made determining direction impossible. Radio chatter intensified as unit commanders reported breakthrough attempts at multiple points. The synchronized nature of these assaults suggested careful reconnaissance and planning. Major Tanaka watched a Soviet sniper team establish position in a cluster of rocks 200 meters away. They moved with practiced efficiency, one providing cover while the other selected firing angles. Their camouflage blended perfectly with autumn vegetation. Only the metallic glint of a rifle scope had revealed their location. The snapping of branches returned, closer this time. Sergeant Ishida swiveled his weapon toward the sound, finger hovering over the trigger. 3 distinct cracks echoed from different directions, each one suggesting movement but revealing nothing concrete. The psychological effect was immediate and deliberate. Every Japanese soldier strained to identify threats that remained invisible. Soviet mortars opened fire from concealed positions. The shells arced high above the tree line before crashing down among Japanese defensive positions. Unlike conventional artillery barrages that announced themselves with distant thunder, these rounds arrived with minimal warning. The forest canopy muffled sound until impact, when earth and shrapnel erupted in devastating surprises. Colonel Yamamoto realized his radio reports to division headquarters painted an increasingly desperate picture. Enemy forces had infiltrated what should have been secure rear areas. Supply routes faced constant harassment from small teams that struck without warning and vanished before countermeasures could respond. The linear battle his commanders expected had become a 3-dimensional maze. The morning progressed with a series of probing attacks that tested Japanese responses at multiple points. Soviet tactics emphasized mobility over mass, using forest terrain to approach defensive positions from unexpected angles. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed enemies would reveal themselves through massed formations. These opponents remained phantoms until the moment of contact. Major Tanaka observed Soviet combat engineers working methodically to clear obstacles his men had spent weeks constructing. They approached each barrier systematically, using explosives and tools carried in lightweight packs. Their efficiency suggested extensive practice with similar challenges. Every defensive innovation met with practiced countermeasures. The radio brought word of breakthroughs along the northern perimeter. Units that had reported stable defensive positions minutes earlier now described enemy forces in their rear areas. The speed of penetration exceeded all tactical projections. Forest warfare had compressed time and space into a series of sudden encounters that favored preparation over position. Sergeant Ishida watched Soviet infantry advance through undergrowth using fire and movement techniques adapted for dense terrain. They communicated through hand signals rather than radio chatter, maintaining silence that preserved their advantage. When they did engage, muzzle flashes revealed positions for seconds before the shooters relocated. The afternoon brought news that shattered remaining confidence in defensive plans. Soviet tank units had penetrated forest routes that engineering surveys had deemed impassable. Modified T-34s pushed through gaps between trees that seemed too narrow for armored vehicles. The impossible had become reality through engineering adaptations that Japanese intelligence had failed to anticipate. Colonel Yamamoto faced the inevitable conclusion his military training had never prepared him to accept. The forest had transformed from neutral terrain into an active participant favoring Soviet forces. Every tactical advantage his position should have provided had been neutralized or reversed. The sound of breaking branches now announced another probing attack from yet another unexpected direction. The metallic screech of tank treads against frozen earth cut through the pre-dawn darkness as Soviet T-34s maneuvered into position along the forest edge. August 12, 1945. The Manchurian wilderness stretched endlessly before them, its dense pine canopy concealing movements that would reshape the war's final chapter. Frost clung to gun barrels despite the summer season, testament to the brutal cold that descended upon these borderlands each night. General Kravchenko pressed his field glasses against tired eyes, studying the Japanese defensive positions 3 kilometers ahead. The metallic screech returned on the wind, a sound that would haunt these forests for decades to come. The Soviet armor had spent 18 hours moving through terrain deemed impassable by Japanese intelligence. Logs served as makeshift bridges across ravines. Entire companies pushed disabled vehicles up impossible slopes, using nothing but rope and determination. The forest itself became their weapon. Lieutenant Yamamoto crouched behind a hastily constructed earthwork, watching shadows move between distant trees. His regiment had held this position for 6 days, expecting a conventional frontal assault across the open ground. Instead, the trees themselves seemed alive with movement. Equipment rattled somewhere beyond visual range. Voices carried on wind currents, speaking a language that meant death to everything he had sworn to protect. The Japanese had built their defenses assuming Soviet forces would follow predictable patterns. Wide trenches faced the obvious approach routes. Machine gun nests covered open fields. Artillery zeroed in on likely assembly areas. Yet the enemy refused to cooperate with these expectations. Soviet engineers had spent weeks studying topographical maps, identifying paths through seemingly impenetrable woodland. They found game trails used by deer for generations, ancient logging roads, overgrown but still passable, creek beds that could hide the movement of entire battalions. The forest revealed its secrets to those patient enough to listen. Sergeant Petrov led his reconnaissance team along a ridgeline invisible from below. Each man carried equipment stripped to absolute essentials. No unnecessary metal that might catch sunlight. No loose straps that could snag on branches. They moved like hunters, reading the terrain's natural rhythm. Below them, Japanese positions remained fixed on conventional threats. Sentries watched open ground while shadows crept closer through cover they had never considered vulnerable. The forest had become a vast flanking maneuver, kilometers wide and perfectly silent. The metallic screech echoed again, closer now. Yamamoto felt his stomach tighten as he realized the sound came from multiple directions simultaneously. His radio crackled with confused reports. Movement north of position 7. Possible contacts west of the supply depot. Unconfirmed sightings along the entire perimeter. Kravchenko checked his watch. 0430 hours. Dawn would break in 90 minutes, revealing positions that needed to remain hidden. His forces had achieved something textbook military doctrine claimed impossible, surrounding a prepared enemy without detection. The forest had become their cloak. A sniper's rifle whispered from the tree line. A Japanese machine gunner slumped forward, his weapon suddenly silent. Then another shot, from a completely different angle. Panic began spreading through the defensive positions as soldiers realized they faced threats from directions their fortifications could not address. Soviet mortars opened fire from concealed positions within the woodland itself. Shells arced over tree canopy, landing with devastating accuracy on coordinates pre-registered during weeks of patient observation. Return fire scattered uselessly into empty forest, striking trees that concealed no targets. The Japanese commander ordered illumination rounds, desperate to reveal his invisible enemies. Flares burst overhead, casting harsh shadows between pine trunks. For brief moments, Soviet silhouettes became visible before melting back into darkness. The light revealed nothing useful, merely confirming that threats surrounded them from all sides. Petrov's team reached their designated position overlooking the main Japanese command post. Through his scope, he could see officers bent over maps, trying to understand an attack that violated every principle they had studied. Radios carried increasingly frantic requests for reinforcement, for air support, for any solution to enemies who fought like ghosts. The forest warfare doctrine had required months of preparation. Soviet forces practiced moving silently through dense undergrowth. They learned to navigate by subtle landmarks invisible to untrained eyes. Each soldier memorized multiple infiltration routes, backup positions, rally points known only to his unit. Tank columns continued their approach through seemingly impossible terrain. Engineers had cleared paths during the night, removing obstacles that would betray their presence once daylight arrived. Tree branches bent back into place behind passing vehicles. Wheel ruts were carefully camouflaged. The forest closed behind Soviet forces like water, leaving no trace of their passage. Yamamoto received orders to fall back to secondary positions. As his men began their withdrawal, they discovered Soviet troops already occupied the routes they intended to use. The forest had become a maze where every path led toward enemy guns. Escape routes that existed on paper proved to be carefully prepared killing grounds. The metallic screech grew louder, accompanied now by the distinctive rumble of diesel engines under load. T-34 tanks emerged from woodland that should have been impassable to armored vehicles. Their guns trained on positions now revealed as perfectly vulnerable from unexpected angles. The metallic screech of tank treads against frozen gravel echoed through the morning mist of August 12, 1945. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura pressed his palm against the cold steel hull of the Type 97 Chiha, feeling the vibrations travel up through his bones as the column of Japanese armor crawled along the narrow mountain road 30 kilometers west of Hilar. The Manchurian dawn carried the sharp scent of pine needles mixed with diesel exhaust, a combination that had become the signature of their retreat. Subscribe and witness the final hours of an empire's last stand in Manchuria. Nakamura studied the forest edge through his binoculars, scanning the dense wall of birch and spruce that stretched endlessly on both sides of the road. Somewhere beyond that green curtain, Soviet forces were moving. Radio chatter from forward scouts had grown sporadic since midnight, then stopped altogether. The silence itself had weight now, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. Behind him, Sergeant Yamamoto emerged from the commander's hatch of the second tank, his weathered face mapping the strain of 3 days without proper sleep. The sergeant's hands moved in practiced efficiency, checking ammunition counts and fuel gauges while his eyes never stopped moving across the tree line. Both men knew that the forest held advantages for those who understood its rhythms. The column consisted of 8 Type 97 tanks, 2 Type 94 tankettes, and 6 trucks, carrying the remnants of the 23rd Tank Regiment. What had begun as a fighting retreat from Hylar had transformed into something more desperate, a race against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very trees themselves. Soviet ski troops had appeared twice in the past day, emerging from woodland paths that Japanese maps insisted did not exist, striking with automatic weapons before vanishing back into the green maze. Nakamura lifted his field radio, the static crackling like distant flames. Forward reconnaissance had reported movement 5 kilometers ahead. Not the rumble of conventional armor, but something else. Footsteps in snow, the snap of branches arranged too deliberately, voices speaking Russian in whispers that carried further than they should. The forest was teaching the Soviets its secrets while keeping the Japanese locked outside its mysteries. The lead tankette suddenly halted, its driver's periscope swiveling left and right like a nervous animal testing the air. Through his own optics, Nakamura caught the glint of metal among the birch trunks, not the dull gray of Soviet armor, but something smaller, more organic in its placement. Movement flickered between the trees, shapes that appeared human, but moved with the fluid grace of creatures born to woodland warfare. Yamamoto's voice carried across the gap between tanks, low and urgent. Intelligence reports from other retreating units spoke of Soviet forest fighters who seemed to exist in harmony with their environment. They built no permanent positions, left no clear tracks, yet appeared wherever Japanese forces felt most vulnerable. Local Manchurian guides had begun deserting rather than face these ghost soldiers who turned the forest itself into a weapon. The temperature dropped as clouds gathered overhead, and with it came the first flakes of early snow, unusual for August, but the Manchurian climate followed its own rules. Each snowflake that settled on the tank's armor seemed to whisper of winter's approach, of supplies growing thin and reinforcements that would never come. The Soviet forces understood this land's moods, had learned to read its warnings and use its gifts. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest, too sharp and sudden to be natural. Nakamura felt his muscles tense as training took over, his hands moving to weapons controls while his mind calculated angles and escape routes. The sound came from the right flank, then echoed from the left, as if the forest itself was closing around them. Whatever was out there had patience, discipline, and intimate knowledge of terrain that the Japanese could only navigate, never truly comprehend. The radio crackled again, bringing fragmentary reports from units further south. Soviet forest specialists had overrun 3 supply convoys in the past 12 hours, appearing from concealed positions that offered perfect fields of fire before melting back into wilderness that swallowed pursuit attempts whole. These were not the massed tank formations that Japanese doctrine had prepared to face, but something more primitive and infinitely more dangerous. Nakamura watched steam rise from his breath as anxiety mixed with the cold mountain air. The forest stretched ahead and behind, offering no clear destination and no safe haven. Somewhere in that green labyrinth, Soviet soldiers were moving with the confidence of predators in their natural habitat, while his column remained trapped on a single road like prey following a trail to slaughter. The metallic screech returned, louder now, as the column prepared to move forward into whatever waited beyond the next bend. The morning of August 19th brought an unsettling quiet to the Manchurian forests. Colonel Tanaka stood beside his remaining staff officers, watching smoke columns rise from distant Soviet positions through field glasses. The metallic tang of spent ammunition still lingered in the air, that familiar scent that had become their constant companion throughout this campaign. 6 days had passed since Operation August Storm began, and the Japanese Kwantung Army found itself facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The Soviets moved through these dense woodlands with an almost supernatural efficiency, appearing and vanishing like phantoms among the birch and pine trees. Tanaka lowered his binoculars and studied the faces of his men. Captain Watanabe, his communications officer, had aged a decade in less than a week. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually precise uniform hung loose on his diminished frame. The wireless crackled with fragmented reports from other units, most requesting immediate reinforcement or evacuation. The forest warfare tactics employed by the Red Army had shattered every assumption the Japanese High Command held about Soviet capabilities. These were not the clumsy formations they expected, but seasoned veterans who understood how to use terrain as their greatest weapon. They struck from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinated their attacks with artillery observers hidden in treetops, and disappeared before counterattacks could be organized. Subordinate units reported encounters with Soviet snipers who could remain motionless for hours in camouflaged positions. Infantry squads described being stalked by enemy reconnaissance teams who knew every game trail and logging road. Most disturbing were accounts of Soviet engineers who had transformed ordinary forest clearings into killing fields with concealed anti-tank weapons and interlocking fields of fire. Tanaka examined the tactical map spread across a fallen log. Red marks indicated confirmed Soviet positions, but the pattern revealed the true scope of their predicament. The enemy had not simply advanced in straight lines. They had enveloped entire Japanese formations using forest paths that didn't appear on any military chart. Supply columns found themselves cut off from their destinations. Command posts discovered they were surrounded without warning. The wireless operator received another transmission from battalion headquarters. Major Ishida's voice carried poorly through the static, but his message was clear. Withdraw to secondary defensive positions immediately. The primary line had become untenable. Soviet forces were advancing on 3 separate axes, using the forest canopy to conceal their movements from aerial reconnaissance. Watanabe approached with the latest casualty reports. Numbers that should have represented tactical statistics instead told the story of complete tactical breakdown. Entire companies had simply disappeared during night operations. Others returned with half their strength, reporting contact with enemy forces that seemed to materialize from the forest floor itself. The most experienced sergeants spoke in hushed tones about Soviet forest warfare techniques that defied conventional military doctrine. Enemy soldiers appeared to move through undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. They established observation posts in locations that seemed impossible to access. Most unnerving was their ability to coordinate complex maneuvers across vast distances without detectable radio communications. Tanaka remembered his training at the Imperial War College, where instructors had emphasized Japanese superiority in jungle warfare based on experiences in Southeast Asia. Those lessons seemed irrelevant now. The Manchurian forests operated according to different rules, and the Soviets had written the handbook. A distant explosion echoed through the trees, artillery finding another Japanese position. The sound carried strangely in the dense woodland, seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously. This acoustic confusion was another element of Soviet forest warfare that disrupted Japanese coordination. Orders became unclear when commanders couldn't determine the direction of enemy fire. The metallic scent grew stronger as the wind shifted. Somewhere nearby, Soviet forces were preparing for another assault. Tanaka could feel it in the oppressive stillness that preceded each attack. Birds had stopped calling. Even the insects seemed to sense approaching violence. His remaining officers gathered their equipment with practiced efficiency. Every man understood that their current position was no longer defensible. The Soviets had demonstrated repeatedly that they could infiltrate any defensive line using forest approaches that Japanese doctrine failed to anticipate. Young Lieutenant Endo approached with intelligence reports from escaped civilians. Local Manchurian residents described Soviet troops who moved through the forests like hunters, using traditional woodcraft combined with modern military technology. They traveled light, lived off the land, and struck where Japanese forces least expected resistance. The withdrawal began in good order, but Tanaka knew their situation continued deteriorating. Each fallback position brought them closer to complete encirclement. Soviet forces seemed to anticipate every tactical decision, positioning themselves along retreat routes before Japanese units even began moving. As they moved deeper into the forest, evidence of Soviet preparation became apparent. Trees had been marked with subtle signs visible only to trained observers. Concealed supply caches supported extended operations far from conventional logistical support. Most significantly, the enemy had established a network of observation posts that provided real-time intelligence on Japanese movements. The final radio transmission from division headquarters confirmed what every soldier already understood. The Kwantung Army's defensive strategy had failed completely. Soviet forest warfare capabilities had transformed the Manchurian campaign from a conventional military operation into a nightmare of invisible enemies and impossible tactical situations. Tanaka paused beside a small stream, allowing his men to refill their canteens. The metallic scent was fainter here, mixed with the earthy smell of forest loam and running water. For a brief moment, the woods seemed peaceful, until the distant rumble of Soviet tanks reminded him that nowhere in Manchuria remained safe for Japanese forces. That evening, as surrender negotiations began across multiple fronts, Tanaka finally understood the true nature of Soviet forest warfare. It was not simply a tactical doctrine, but a comprehensive military philosophy that integrated terrain, psychology, and logistics into an overwhelming advantage. The Kwantung Army had been defeated not just by superior numbers or equipment, but by an enemy that understood how to fight in harmony with the natural environment rather than despite it. The metallic tang lingered in the air one final time as Japanese forces laid down their weapons, marking the end of an empire's expansion and the beginning of a new understanding of modern warfare in the world's great forests.